You're right. Hello. Um, let's see. My brain is a bit fried because I had like back-to-back meetings all day. Not just like work meetings, but I had lunch with a friend who's just as excited about me about things. So I'm a bit. You'll have to excuse me if I am a bit erratic. Is that the word? Let's see. I just need some music. Anyways, so we were working on adding suspense to this UI Lib. So let's continue working on that. Let me just check that everything's fine here. It is. Okay, cool. Good afternoon, Adam. Let's see. So last time we wrote a plan for suspense, like conceptualized it. We discussed how React and Solid is fundamentally like different, how React is using the related transition API, not just for suspense, but also to schedule UI updates in general, which Solid doesn't really do, which makes it weird that should it really have a transitions API in Solid? Does that even make sense? Because it becomes so decoupled. How you change state and how that leads to an async side effect, like any kind of effect, or like decoupledness leads to. So what we decided to do is, do we actually have that here? No, we didn't add that. Where did we? Yeah, here we have it. Sorry. So what we ended up talking about is that we need a way to, well, initially we wanted to just do something async, which would still work. You can still do this, but the problem is that async isn't just a value. It's something that updates over time, and you need some way to control that. Like, should it, every time you update it, should it trigger the suspense boundary, or should it not trigger the suspense boundary? Only the first time. Cache key. Yeah. And then should it immediately fetch something? Wait, I want to think about this some more. Sorry, Adam. I know you're excited about the implementation, but let me remove this cache key thing. Because a lot of async behavior, like this lazy, you don't have to do that. If you want it to be lazy, you just create a function instead, right? You would just do get user. And then you would do this. Or would you? No, you wouldn't do it like this. That doesn't make sense. I have to get back into this. Oh, sorry. So it would be... Yeah, I guess... No, sorry. The thing we talked about, the primary reason we created this API, which we haven't implemented yet, we need to spec that out and implement it. But the reason we created that is because sometimes you want to use suspense, sometimes you don't. So sometimes you want to know if it's pending, if it has an error, or if there is some data there. So you don't do, sorry, profile.promise. So sometimes you would rather do like, you would check if profile is pending, right? And you return something and it has nothing to do with suspense. And then the other thing is that you also want to, so query.promise is just returning a promise, which is what triggers suspense. Sorry, profile profile.promise. But the other thing you want to do is you want to imperatively be able to refresh the value. So that's what fetch does. Yes, that's important. And you could say that you don't need that the only reason you want to fetch a new value is because, for example, the ID changes. That's the only reason this thing is going to refetch. But maybe you don't have an ID. Maybe you just have some data that doesn't even have any reactiveness to it. It's just something you fetch from the server, and then some logic in the app wants you to refetch that data. And then you don't have any way to do that. I'm thinking. Oops. Yeah, exactly. But then it's like, okay, so there's one avenue I want to go down before we continue. What if you don't do this? What if you have profile promise of a profile? Oh, sorry, this is weird. I thought this was typing. So you have, sorry, profile. And if you want to run that immediately, you say fetch something ID. So you're fetching the profile. So basically create state supports promise. So what's interesting about this is that we can enhance that promise. So if you were to say state.profile, this will be like a promise. It would work with suspense and everything. And it could also have state profile is pending. It could have these values on the promise. And this is what React and Solid does as well. They're enhancing the promise with some additional values for the suspense to understand. At least React does that. And then if you actually want to fetch again, you just do get user, and then you say state profile equals fetch, well, I guess fetch profile. Yeah, so you would get profile, sorry. I have to excuse me. Wait, sorry. No, fetch profile. Yeah, so you have that initial value. The thing is, what if you want to automatically change the profile if the ID changes? Like you want to auto run the thing. I remember in Overmind, we used to allow functions and they acted as derived. So state profile wouldn't be a function. It would be the actual returned result from the function, but it could be an observation scope so that if the ID changes, this will automatically run again. And then So if it's lazy, it just means that it's null, right? And then you just go fetch it later. So there is no concept of lazy. I think the only problem with this approach is that how do you configure if it should always throw to suspense or if you want that to be lazy? Yeah. Yeah, you could do like refresh. Um, I'm thinking about the yeah, so like the thing is that create state is already a proxy. So we have a lot of flexibility. And the question is like, do you want to do that? Because now we're kind of, it's not as JavaScript anymore. We're saying that create state handles this differently, but that it is a primitive. Like create state is a thing. It's not just an object making a proxy. It's like it does observation tracking and all of this stuff, or mutation tracking. So you can say that, okay, when you put functions in there, those are treated as derived. So what comes out here is like profile dot, state dot profile becomes the value of the derived. We did this in Overmind, and that worked really great. But then there are things like it's something that needs to be documented and explained, and then what happens if you replace it? I guess that's fine. But you could also do this, right? You could just fetch profile, get the promise. So there's really two things we're adding. We're adding an observable promise, and we're adding, so this will be an observable promise, and this is a derived state that returns an observable promise. And then there's a question of serialization. If you put promises and functions in this, you can't serialize it. So you can never serialize the profile. But you can't really do it here either. So yeah, that's also an observable promise. Yeah, but it could be called something. It didn't have to be an actual promise. Like you could have profile dot promise. So you have the promise. I guess to some extent it becomes, yeah, it becomes observable, but you wouldn't actually add values to the promise, because what happens is that it's the reactive child that manages the state of the promise. It's not the promise itself. While here you have to put the state on the promise, I guess. Well, no, I guess you don't have to do that. Yeah, so what if, okay, let's do the first one. So what if you put a promise in state and you use that promise in a reactive child? Then the reactive child manages the state of that promise. Well, the promise needs to know if it's resolved so that you can get the immediate value. No, so you need some state on the promise. Yeah, so you need that regardless. Well, no, you don't need that. I'm getting confused with React because React will render again and again, but this won't do that. Yeah, so I don't think you need, so okay, just to do it again. So state.profile is just a plain promise. I think that the thing is, like, what if you use it in two different places? Like this. Then this second reactive child wouldn't know that this has been resolved. Maybe this was behind like a, I don't know, state blah null, and then we show the profile. So the profile has already been resolved, but here it hasn't, and then it's being returned, and it's just a promise. So the reactive child has to do a then on it, right, to figure out what the state is. So, but we can add a value to the promise, just like React does, and Solid. Like they have this latest thing. Yeah, so that's no biggie. Yeah, so I guess this isn't like, yeah, I think the bigger question is, yeah, so this is the question. Should create state support the right values? So that means the double as well, right? Double could just be state.count 2. But I know, Adam, that this is a problem, right? Isn't it? That there's a state issue with this. Yeah. Because state, let's see. Do we have state here? I don't think this resolves correctly in terms of typing, because this hasn't been evaluated yet. So TypeScript gets confused. We should check that. Hello. So, yeah, whatever. Oh, state 2. No, that works. Okay, cool. Nice. I think it was a getter, and that was the issue last time. But this works. That's fine. Okay, so what if there's just a first class concept of consuming promises in a reactive child? That is suspense. And let's say that if that promise hasn't been resolved yet, like there aren't any values added to the promise, it's going to throw to suspense, and then those values are going to be added to the promise. So if the promise is used in any other context, it doesn't necessarily throw to suspense. Great, that's a good concept regardless. And then the question becomes, should we have derived functions in create state? So the good thing about having that in state is that you can actually replace. Well, you don't have to do that. You can have refresh. Yeah, and we already have refresh. Ugh. But it's weird to have. Well, yeah, the thing is, double here is kind of, this is now a function, right? Well, if we have the right functions here, you can just say double, right? You can't say, you have to call this to evaluate it. So that's more consistent. Create state. Yeah, maybe it is cleaner. I guess sure is less stuff. And then there is a question of like serializability. Like this thing is never going to run on the server, by the way. It's not going to be a server side thing. Yeah, that's also a good question. Like actions. What I'm thinking is like actions is on the outside, but that's also a question. Like, what if you want this context mixed with state and actions? Let's imagine this is like a hook. You can't like do this and then increment, for example. This is going to break it because you're accessing all the observed values and you're kind of flattening them. So you lose observability. Huh? No? Oh, fuck. I have to go. I miss... there's a thing in kindergarten. But yeah, anyways, you would have to do like state and actions like this. But this is another thing that's been bothering me a little bit. And the way you could resolve this is that, okay, no, you can put the increment in here. But if you do that, then you have the this thing, which is not good. One thing is if you're actually doing classes, it's a good thing, but yeah. So yeah, I think we're, this was supposed to be a celebratory stream. We're getting stuck in. But you know, I actually have to stop the stream. But I'm gonna think about this. Like, this is the decision to make. It doesn't matter for the suspense implementation, but it matters for the next step. Like, should there be a concept of derived in create state where, yeah, and one thing is like, is pending error data. These are things that are being applied at the consumption point of the promise. But refresh, this is something that would have to be added at the definition of the promise. So that means create state is responsible for adding refresh. Which feels weird. And then you could say, oh, maybe the derived should be refresh. Because it's not the actual promise you're refreshing. It's the derived you're refreshing. Yeah. Yeah, no, I'm hesitant about that. I think it does make sense to do profile, fetch profile ID. Because this profile, this isn't just a promise. This is the async thing. So you can say refresh, you can have the other observable things, all of that. Yeah. And then derived is simply just creating a function. Like, I love the simplicity of that. And then if any options would be needed, there is an opportunity to do that. And then as part of the lazy thing, like the only thing that happens here now is that it will immediately call fetch profile. That's the thing. But what you could do, which we actually did in some version of this, is that it doesn't actually execute this until you access a value. So if your access is pending, if you access any of these, sorry, if we do this, if you access any of these here, it's going to start the fetching. So it's just intelligently lazy. But it's implicit. So maybe you want to have an explicit lazy. Yeah. Anyways, let's reflect on that, and then we'll do both implementations the next time I get a chance to stream. Yeah. Sorry, Adam. You know, life, and it's gonna be a while. Yeah, so I won't be able to stream later today. I wanted to do too many things today. I was late from lunch to a meeting. Then I was late to a one-on-one from a coffee chat with another colleague. But yeah, okay. We'll speak soon. Bye-bye.